today's teleconference. The topic is disaster management of floods. We will be dividing the topic of today into two parts. The first will be dealing with the preparedness and prevention aspects, and the second part will be dealing with the relief and response and the recovery aspects. Today, besides me, we have here Dr. Durgesh Nandini. I will be taking the topic of preparedness and prevention of the disaster management of floods, and Dr. Durgesh Nandini will be dealing with the later part of the disaster management, that is recovery and response. Before we begin with the prevention and the preparatory aspects of disasters, of the preparatory aspects of floods, let us in fact see as how floods develop, or what causes floods, or what is when we say floods are. Floods occur when water submerges the land. The land which never had water gets submerged with water now. So, when this kind of a condition occurs, there is a flood. Or when the natural confines of a river or the natural shape of a river gets broken and the river water gets flooded into the land area, we have floods. Now, what causes floods? In eastern part of our country, we have great amount of flooding taking place during the monsoon rains. Now, what is in fact the cause of these floods? There are many factors. As we all know that when there are heavy rains, floods are caused. There is great amount of rain, there is great duration of rain, and the intensity is also high. There is a probability of a flood taking place. The second most important factor for a flood taking place is the high tides. When there are high tides, water crosses the floodplain and enters into the upland. The third most important factor is the topographical feature, as what kind of soil condition is existing, whether the floodplain area is having more alluvial kind of soil, or whether it is a delta kind of a area formed by the rivers, or whether it is in fact the catchment area is very plain, is plain like. In such a condition, there is a probability of flood. So, the topographical features of that area add to having floods or not. The again most important factor here is the melting of snow or the ice. When snow melts or ice melts, there is every chance of a flood. There is also possibility of flood taking place when there are heavy rains due to cyclonic storms. There is again a feature of drainage basin. If the drainage size, shape and the permeability is not proper, is not good, there is every chance of flood taking place. So, these are certain factors which amount to the probability of floods. The flood may be of a high degree or of a low degree depending on these factors. There are certain human generated factors as well. If people start staying in floodplain areas, there is great amount of urbanization that takes place in floodplain areas. People do not abide by the coastal zone regulations, and the construction is not paying heed to the design or the engineering techniques. These all amount to people getting killed or people getting injured because floods in fact penetrate into these regions. Amounting to these factors, there are in fact greater amount of morbidities or greater amount of mortalities because of people drowning in water, people suffering from snake bites or animal bites, people in fact suffering mental or physical trauma, people in fact undergoing infectious diseases or communicable diseases because of the contamination of water. So, or because of electrocution, the people die or people get hurt. So, when floods come with a high degree, with a high velocity, with a greater intensity, there is every probability of greater mortalities, morbidities and injuries. So, once we know what are floods and what are the factors that cause floods, we will be now coming to the main aspect, and that is the preparation as well, that is the prevention as well as the preparedness aspects. The first step in the preparation as well as the prevention aspect is mitigation. Mitigation means when we try to remove the adverse consequences of a disaster. Here, when we speak about floods, we are trying to mitigate or remove the adverse causes or the adverse consequences of floods, that being deaths, injuries as well as sicknesses or the diseases that people get from a flood. So, how does mitigation take place? Mitigation being the first aspect of prevention, it is a preventive measure. there are two ways of mitigation. One is the structural mitigation and the other is the non-structural measure of mitigation. The structural measure means that engineered techniques are used in the construction of buildings, construction of the flood walls or the dikes. If engineering techniques and the designs are used, then the chances of deaths being caused or injuries happening can lessen. The other mitigative measure is the non-structural measure. Non-structural measure here means that there are policies, there are legislations, there are building codes, and there is program for afforestation, for plantation. Like we had the tsunami where the greater amount of losses occurred in areas which didn't have forest cover. So if we have forests, if we have proper trees, plantations like mangrove trees and all, then they help a great deal in preventing the velocity or the intensity of the flood water. So the gushing water that comes, the intensity of it becomes very low because of plantation and forests. So this is a very important factor, and here the vital factor is community participation. If the people participate in all these activities, then non-structural measures become very successful. So there are two types of mitigation measures, of structural as well as non-structural. After mitigation, the second step that we in fact have is the warning and preparedness. Before we talk about warning, there is one step, that is the watch. Watch happens means there is a watch signal also given before the warning signal. Now the difference between a watch signal and a warning signal is that watch is issued when the probability of that disaster is very low, when the probability of the disaster is not that severe, or it's causing a great amount of deaths is also not there, or it does not touch the region, or it may just pass by the region. So when a yes and no chances is there for a particular disaster, then a watch signal is only issued. In case if the disaster is going to be severe to a region where it is going to cause heavy deaths to the livestock or to the people, and it is going to affect the infrastructure of the area, then a warning signal is issued. That is, watching is issued only when there is a low intensity, when there is a low probability of a disaster striking that area, and warning is issued when there is a greater chance of that disaster hitting that area and causing many consequences, adverse consequences. The most important factor for warning and watch is that time management has to be there. It has to be issued in proper time. If time is not paid heed to and the people have shorter duration of evacuating, then people can't evacuate in a shorter duration, and hence there is loss of lives and livestock, and there is even the crops and all also get damaged. So the time factor, the time of the dissemination of the of the warning signal, of the warning information, and in the language of the people along with the cultural factor have to be paid heed to. This happens especially in case of people who are vulnerable, like there are people who are old, who are handicapped, who are children, who are staying in very remote areas. They have to have more lead time in order to evacuate. So in case if we give the warning at the end time, there is difficulty in evacuating such vulnerable lots. So the time factor has to be given more importance. Today when we have the information and communication technology, we can in fact have proper warning systems, and if we have proper warning systems, then we can in fact give warnings at least some 3 or 4 days in advance. So this can be in fact used, information and technology can be used for proper warning and preparedness. The third most important step in the prevention and preparedness measure is in fact the need assessment. What kind of need assessment? The assessment of the public as well as the health services, the assessment of the pharmaceutical industry, pharmaceuticals that are required, the assessment of the requirement of water, of food, of hygiene and sanitation methods, as well as electricity, sewage. This has all to be assessed properly, and this has to be supplied according to the needs of the population of that affected area. even one can go and ask randomly to the people as what are their needs, and those needs can be fulfilled. And one most important factor in need assessment is that it has to be people based. You can't give those things to the people of that area which they are not used to or they do not want. So, in that case we end up in fact giving them something which they do not require, and they still in fact wait for things which they really require, and that needs are never assessed. So, need assessment has to be very proper and scientific. The fourth most important step in the prevention and preparedness aspect is the surveillance. There are three kinds of surveillance. One is the mortality surveillance, the other is the morbidity surveillance, and the third is the lab surveillance. We require to take the mortality surveillance for the reason to know about the mortality, the deaths taking place because of flood, so that in future preventive measures can be taken to prevent those deaths. Morbidity surveillance is also required to know as what factors are causing that particular disease to perpetuate in that particular area. If that area is endemic to any particular disease, then that infectious disease that is endemic to the area has to be controlled and contained, and measures have to be taken. So, that is why morbidity surveillance is undertaken. The third is the lab surveillance. Why lab surveillance? To test the kind of water which has got contaminated because of the flood water. It has got mixed up with the sewage water, or there would have been so much waste that has come into that water and it has contaminated and it is not proper for human use. So, the sources of water as well as the water which the people are using have to be checked, have to be tested in the lab. The surveillance, basically what happens is when the surveillance takes place, it is usually for 1 month after the disaster. This is in fact a very short time, and it does not make any sense, because deaths and injuries take place or diseases take place even after a month of the disaster. So, the most important thing for a surveillance is that it should continue for the response and recovery time also. So, then only it makes proper sense. One has also to assess the medical health providers in that area. So, a survey has to be done as where the medical hospitals are, where the hospitals are, where the medical centers are, where are the medical service providers, and are there any temporary relief camps to the people. So, all this has to be surveyed for as a preparatory measure for meeting the disaster. After speaking the preparation as well as the preventive aspects for the disaster management of floods, now we will in fact take the response as well as the recovery aspect of the disaster management of flood. Dr. Nandini will be in fact talking about the two items.
You will be thinking that how to provide relief to the victims of disaster, particularly floods, and it is affecting most in the rural areas, because their houses are either kacha pakka houses or kacha houses, or construction in such a manner that it is affecting them very badly in the situation of floods. So, how to prevent them? We have certain slides which will highlight the typical post disaster needs. In the initial response stage, what is more important, that is search, rescue and evacuation, medical assistance, disaster assessment, and short term food and water provision, water purification, epidemiological surveillance, temporary shelter, and the secondary response system covers repair or reconstruction of the houses, re-establish or create employment, assist with recovery of agriculture through loans, distribution of farm equipment and tools, assist with recovery of small and business and fisheries, particularly small scale businessmen. Here, what is more important when we provide relief to our victims, that is search and rescue, means we have to identify the areas which is badly affected with flood or disaster, then the persons who are affected. So, our primary importance remains with the humans to identify and secure and protect those people, to bring them out from the flood situation. Secondary importance is to livestock, as we have seen in last floods, particularly in Orissa and West Bengal. In Assam, 70% livestock was died and affected very badly because of floods. And we have seen in last floods in Orissa that more than 200 health centers were affected. And now how to provide assistance, medical assistance to the victims? It becomes very difficult. So, for that purpose, there are number of agencies like governmental and non-governmental agencies, international agencies, which really help at the disaster stricken time period and the people who are really affected and they need help. Here, voluntary organizations immediately come and help those people to come out from the disaster situation. They help them to take to some other place. For that purpose, temporary shelters are required. And for these things, for providing them medical assistance, shelter, food, water and other facilities, national and international agencies help them. They provide funds, they provide equipments, like at that time we need boats also for persons to take them to some safe place. For all these purposes, we really need both, that is manpower and funds. So, for these purposes, our non-governmental organizations, or we say community, immediately come and help to rescue, to search the people. Here, the role of army is also very important. Army help, and we really need the help of helicopters at that time for searching and saving our humanity, humans, people who are really suffering due to disaster. Here, what is more important, after shifting these people to temporary shelters, their basic requirements are food, water and medicines, because due to flood there are number of diseases which spread due to based on water, like diarrhea, it is prevalent. So, how to supply them clean and clear water, and portable water is really difficult at that time after the immediate flood. So, at that time community help comes from outside also. Food packets are distributed with the help of helicopters, we use boats also, and for this purpose number of things are required, like as my colleague said, need assessment. Need assessment is very important. We have to see where we are going, which type of people they are, which type of food they like, we have to see their food habits also, and we have to provide them assistance. There are ladies, women like pregnant or lactant mothers, we have to help them. So, how we will help them? In that case, we really need help of trained workers, like we can say trained nurses also at that time, because persons really need help, medical help at that time. My other colleague will explain you how we will provide medical help to these people, and remaining things like shelter facility. Shelter facility can be provided in school buildings and temporary shelter also, like with the help of tents. In these tents, we provide them all the facilities which they immediately need after the disaster. Here, we need this shelter facility for a limited period, like in other disasters maybe we need for more time, as if it is earthquake, and in floods we need for few days. After that, those people can go back to their houses. Now, the persons who are having kacha pakka houses, they need time, because their houses maybe we have to construct them again, or they need repairs or strengthen them. For that purpose, long term phases are required. We have to keep them in some buildings, like I said, school buildings for few days, and later on we can shift them back to their places. Now, the most affected part is artisans, farmers, because the artisans face their problems and farmers face because their crops are affected. In Orissa, we have seen 70% crops were affected, 100% crops were affected in 80 blocks. So, this is really bad effect of this disaster. How to provide them employment opportunities? Next question arises. Here we can say we can encourage the farmers to go for insurance before this disaster, because this disaster is predictable and well in time we can encourage them for insurance. Insurance will certainly help them and they will get some funds, and in agriculture rehabilitation they can sow again, and after that will really help them in other facilities also, and artisans and others, they can also get this facility from banks and other sources. Our state government also provide them funds for employment opportunities. Small scale industries can help them, particularly women who is vulnerable. Anganwadis can help them. We can start some programs for children also. This way we can help these people who are really affected with disaster. So these are short term and long term plannings for these people. But who is really helping them? They themselves. It is the answer. So we make self-help groups which help. Either it's construction, it's repair, it's strengthening, it's shifting people, clearance of debris, or other kind of help. Naturally, we have to clear the pathways, roads, and we need clear communication. For that purpose, we have to do a lot. Here also, non-governmental organizations help. Now, there are certain people who are dead. So, disposal of dead is also very important, otherwise it will spread disease. Livestock, dead animals, especially at the state level, this is the job of police, and this is done with the help of state funds. But our community people and non-governmental organizations can also help in this purpose. It is important, we have to give care to the image, importance and thinking of the people. Burial are the best forms. For that purpose, fuel is required. So again, our community, NGOs and international agencies, they are providing funds also for that. As I said, our state government is providing, yes. So with the help of all these, we develop such circumstances that the people who are surviving, they can live happily, they can restart their life. Here, social rehabilitation, economic rehabilitation is very important. As I said, we can do for old, for women and for children. In the similar fashion, for economic rehabilitation, we can help the artisans, we can help the farmers. This help comes from the government, and community and non-governmental organizations can also help them. Now, reconstruction and repair of the houses. So, land use planning is very important. We prepare such type of structure that helps at the time of disaster and floods, protect the people, and it is advised that roof should be at such level which should be above the danger level, so that at the time of floods people can go to their roof and stay there for immediate help, at least they can survive. For that purpose, awareness is required. Awareness campaigns are launched. Community, non-governmental organizations, they help. We can teach the students in the schools how to protect themselves and others. While constructing buildings, we can take care that collapse of building should not affect the other building. Houses should be built on that area which is not susceptible to disaster, away from the river, away from the water. That will certainly help them. So, areas are divided in different zones. Area which is not susceptible to disaster, houses and hospitals, schools are built on that area. Here, planner is required. Suggestions, advice and guidance from the planner really help to construct the houses which will not affect the disasters. But this type of problems are more prevalent in rural areas. So what is to be done? Panchayat leaders, they can take care, monitor the construction and repair work of the houses. In addition to that, Some buildings should be constructed in the rural areas where at the time of flood and other disasters people immediately can move. Some storage should be developed or built where food grains can be kept for disaster time. Here again the role of political leaders is very important. Generally during disasters, administrators wait for the orders, but community, NGOs and our political leaders really run to help the public. Their joint efforts are required for the development and for flood management. In providing relief and recovery, as we have already mentioned, structural and non-structural measures, we need mix of both, as land use planning, warning and other non-structural measures help to protect. In the similar way, maintenance of dams, embankments, which are structural measures, is very important. So, regular monitoring, maintenance and coordination is required, particularly for flood management and providing relief. Now, I will request my colleague to add some points.
Here I will in fact point out that there are certain gaps or there are certain limitations when we come to all the 4 stages of disaster management of floods. When we speak about the prevention or the preparedness, or when we speak about the response, recovery, relief, rehabilitation aspects, there are certain gaps in it. Now, what are those critical gaps? Now, these gaps arise due to the factors that go and cause floods, or these problems or these gaps are just because of certain measures which we have still not taken for proper disaster management. These are factors which we still need to take, and research have to be undertaken for these measures to be adopted. And these research has to be basically country wise, has to be cultural wise, then only it will be suitable to the areas where it will be implemented. As we have earlier discussed, there are many factors that cause floods. There may be heavy rains, there may be the topographical features, there may be the sudden burst of the dams, there may be high tides, there may be the cyclonic storms, or there may be the drainage basin which is not capable of managing so much of water flow, and there may be many human basic factors that precipitate the floods, and there may be many a short time of warning and watch that also precipitate floods. So, the gaps emerge from these factors only. We talked about the mitigation factors, the structural measures, the non-structural measures which help in reducing the adverse consequences of floods, but the gaps in these mitigation measures only lead to these limitations. So, we will just analyze as what are those factors that are still waiting for more to be done in these areas, and what are the limitations which we still need to overcome. The first and foremost gap in the entire aspect of flood management of disaster pertaining to preparedness, prevention, response and recovery and rehabilitation is that there is always a mismatch between the mortality rate as well as the mitigation measures that have been adopted. The mitigation measures that are adopted should always suit the measures that have been taken in that area. If the mitigation measures adopted are not in coherence with the measures taken, then in that case there is every chance, there is every probability of more mortality taking place. How? Say for instance, in flood management we take care of certain mitigative measures like having flood walls, having dikes, seeing what kind of a catchment area is that, whether the drainage basin of the river is also the soil in that drainage basin is also very alluvial and all. So, if the mitigation measures that have been taken suits the flood management, then mortality will be very less. Otherwise, if mitigation or the mitigating measures that have been adopted are in crisscross with the flood management or with management of any other disaster, then there is every probability of greater number of injuries and greater number of deaths. So, the first and foremost factor is that whatever measures that we have to take for mitigating the adverse consequences of any disaster, and in this case the floods, there has to always be a match between the mitigative measures as well as the management of that particular disaster. The second most important factor, that is still a gap in the entire what we say PPRR, that is preparedness, prevention, preparedness, response and recovery aspects of a disaster, is that there are lack of they do not take the topographical features. What is the, as I have already said and my colleague had also narrated about the drainage area, the catchment area, the soil condition, all have to be taken into account. Why? Because if the area is having a loose soil, there is every probability of greater soil erosion, and the soil has a capacity to withhold the water flow. It can lessen the intensity of the water, the velocity of the water. But in case if it is a loose soil, it can't do that, and there the flood will be coming in greater intensity and greater volume and greater velocity, and that may be causing a great amount of problems to the people staying there. So, this again is an important factor when the topographical features have to be taken account. The third most important factor is there is always some criteria. Now, what is that criteria? The criteria basically is that one has to always have standardized case definitions. Now, what are these standardized case definitions? Whenever we study any disaster and the consequences of the disaster and the factors that led to the deaths and diseases and the injuries, we have certain standardized definitions. Now, if we do not have the standardized definitions, with every flood there is a chance of people innovating their own case definitions, and so then there will be no uniformity, there will be no standardization. So, for every time if the same case definitions and uniform case definitions have to be used, it is necessary that these case definitions have to be made, have to be studied and have to be uniformly applied in anywhere where there are floods. So, this is the criteria which have to measure the diseases and the deaths, have to be standardized, have to be uniformly applied, and this is where we are lacking. We do not have case definitions regarding the when we study the mortalities and morbidities related to floods. The fourth most important factor is the misclassification. Now, what is this misclassification of deaths and diseases? When does misclassification take place? It takes place when we in fact have multiple disasters. There may be a flood that can be caused by tides, there can be a flood that can be caused by heavy rains, there can be also a flood that is caused by a mudslide, that is avalanches, or by the snow avalanche or by the mud landslide. So, in that case, when there is a flood, there is a flood which is common, but it is because of different factors. One is because of rain, one is because of tide, and one is because of the landslide. We cannot classify the deaths and the diseases pertaining to these three factors in the same category. The deaths due to flood because of high tide may not bury the houses, may not collapse the houses. So, when the houses will not be collapsing in case of a high tide flood, the people will also not be getting buried under that the debris. But in case if there is a cyclonic storm generated flood, there is every probability of the houses getting collapsed and the people getting buried under the houses, and hence the deaths. So, there is always a need that there is a proper classification has to take place of the deaths and the diseases pertaining to different kinds, different subtypes of floods also. So, one may not just put a general category floods, these kind of deaths and diseases take place, but there may be different kinds of deaths and diseases taking place pertaining to different types of floods also, or different types of factors that generated or caused floods. The fourth most important factor is of surveillance. We said what is surveillance? It pertains to doing the surveillance of the morbidity, the mortality, as well as the laboratory surveillance. The most important factor which I mentioned in this point was that the surveillance pertains only to 1 month. It stops after that 1 month and nobody seems bothered. No, the problem is it should be extended, it is not extended beyond that 1 month. What happens? Deaths, diseases, injuries take place even after 1 month. So, immediate relief is provided, immediate response is there, but in the long term also deaths, diseases take place. Now, who will survey them? Who will give them some, who will attribute some reasons for those deaths and all? Because there is no survey and nobody takes account of those matters or those factors which has precipitated those mortalities and injuries. So, one has to extend beyond that 1 month, go beyond that short term relief and go to response as well as recovery till the whole period of that recovery and rehabilitation takes place, because till then deaths, injuries and sickness and diseases can happen. The most important thing, as what my colleague Dr. Nandini was saying, was about community participation. People do not participate. It is necessary to pull them, to motivate them and to make them inclined to work for the community. The community feeling should be imparted, should be built in, it should come from within, that they should do something in a collective way. A collective action is required. People do not adhere to the coastal area regulations because they think it is okay, I will run away, but if it is a community action, nobody will be settling in an area which is floodplain. So, even if the government makes building codes, even if the government makes a regulation, nobody seems to be abiding by it, and that is why we had so much of deaths when the tsunami struck. We had an order, if 500 meters nobody can make, there can be no settlement and habitation, but still the people came and stayed there and there was no check, there was no monitoring. So, people had to be made aware, and people are a very important factor whenever we in fact talk about disaster management of any kind of a hazard. What engineering and construction techniques which we are using? We said about the structural measures that have to be catered to, that have to be adhered to. These engineering measures are not taken care of. We have flood walls that itself collapses when the flood comes. Then what is the use of that flood wall? Is it resisting the flood? Is it resisting the waves? No, it is in fact itself collapsing and adding to the problems of the people there. So, need to have some kind of more codification, more engineering aspects to go into the making of these dikes or making of these flood walls. And I will not say it is the last, but it is not the last but the least, but I will say that the most important factor here again is the dissemination of the warning. The warning, we have the best of satellites today, remote sensing satellites we are having GIS that are being applied, but still the warning that is in fact is not timely. It is of in a very short duration notice is given to the people, and because there is no collective action, there is no community generated watch and ward system. So, because of a shorter duration, there is always a panicky, people get panicky, there is no there is always a fear and panic, and people get shocked, and then in all the confusion prevails, and so when the people evacuate, there are more deaths because of stampede or because of quick or hasty evacuation. So, these are certain gaps which we need to rectify, which we need to overcome, or which we need to work on to have a proper system of disaster management of floods. Now, certain recommendations also can be given here, certain suggestions can be given here based on these limitations. The most important factor is here, that is of surveillance. Surveillance have to go beyond that 1 month, it has to reach to the response as well as the recovery time, so that we come to know as whether there is an increase of the vector population, and in case there is an increase of the vector population or of any infectious disease that is endemic to that area, proper steps can be taken, timely interventions can be made. Topographical features have to be accounted for. If we do not take into account the hydraulic as well as the geologic factor, then we are in fact having improper system of disaster management. Why? Because we have to take care of the soil condition, we have to take care of the drainage basins, and we have also to take care as what are the hydraulic factors there. If we take into account this, I think we will be in fact greatly reducing the mortalities and the injuries that happen. The third most important thing which we can in fact do is the timely warning. It has to be given in time, it has to be disseminated in time, and it has to take place, or it has to be presented in the language which people can understand. It has to take care of the geological, the geographical as well as the cultural factors. The community watch and ward system has to be activated. The people have to be called upon to participate actively in this entire endeavor. Epidemiological assessment. Why do we need epidemiological assessment, or what is basically epidemiology? It is deciding what are the determinants or what is the distribution of deaths and diseases in the entire population. So, if we take the flood has affected say a region of Delhi, then what is epidemiological study doing? It is trying to study the determinants as well as the distribution of deaths, diseases and injuries in that particular population in the region of Delhi. So, this is epidemiological study in short. So, why we need epidemiological surveillance to be undertaken, or why we need epidemiological assessment to be done or to be made? To assess what is the need of that area, what is the existing facility of health as well as medical centers over there. Are there any NGOs working there in this field? Are there required kind of centers who can cater to this to the area in time of a need, in time of a disaster like flood? This has to be taken care. So, if epidemiological assessment take place, one can assess the needs of medical and health services to the people as what people want, what is the area wanting, what is the region's requirement, and this can in fact help us to mitigate most of the adverse consequences. The fourth most important factor that has to be paid heed to is the research should be in fact undertaken on the effectiveness of local warning and watch system, as how effective can they be in eliciting evacuation. We have to take more measures in controlling the vector factor, and people have to be immunized, people have to be inoculated, and there has to be temporary camps, and that should not be mixed with the general temporary camps or temporary shelters that are made. Why? Because medical camps have to be different from the general camps, so that people who have suffered injuries or who are in fact wanting first aid can be shifted to the medical temporary camps, not to the general camps. Certain measures have to be taken to give them food, water, and a proper hygiene and sanitation condition has to be also given. Now, what happens during flood is that people get bitten by animals, people get snake bites, people get electrocuted, people get drowned, people in fact suffer great amount of health effects because of the exposure to radiation or exposure to chemical or toxic substances which get mixed with water, or people get exposed to sewage water. So, all this ends up in great amount of communicable diseases, and sometimes there are chances of epidemic taking place. There can be a malaria, there can be a cholera, as we had in the recent case of tsunami. There was great amount of gastroenteritis problem that took place. Why? Because of all these contaminations and because of the vector problem, because of the infectious diseases and communicable diseases and the vector coming up in such times. So, one has to disinfect that area, one has to see into disinfecting such area, and immediate steps have to be taken to dispose of the dead. The dispose of not only the dead, that is the human beings, but also the stray cattle. I think now I will request Dr. Nandini to add few more points to it and we can sum up.
Thank you very much, Dolly. It was really a good explanation about the medical assistance and help which is required, and the way you have described the health problems at that time and diseases, it's really nice. I think learners will be very clear about the idea of diseases and medical help which is required. With these words, I will say thank you very much.